I think people are going to trickle in just a few more minutes, but we'll go ahead and just get started by introducing us. So I'm Ashley, the founder of Traverse Journeys, and we have with us Ryan. He's our local host in Iceland. Do you want to introduce yourself, Ryan?
Yeah, hi guys. Yeah, my name is Ryan. I'm one of the owners of the company Hidden Iceland. I first met Ashley back in 2018 was when we started talking to each other, and we've been sort of co-running these trips together ever since, and it's been a fantastic partnership, I think. I hope you agree.
Yes, absolutely. We've had Iceland on our radar for so long, and COVID set us back a little bit, but we were able to run our first trip in 2021 and have loved doing so since. So just for a little introduction to Traverse, just 1 minute as I get back to my slides. So we focus on people, planet, purpose. So what that really means to us is we have a lot of personal relationships with our guides, with our on-the-ground partners. You know, for travelers, we want you to have fully immersive experiences and not get to just know a destination, but the people there as well. And so that's a really meaningful thing for us. And in our travel, we really seek sustainable tourism practices, whether it's reducing plastic, leaving no trace in the environment, reducing our carbon footprint, and then also purpose. So we really seek to provide transformative experiences that are inspirational, that spark curiosity, that have adventure elements to them. So that's kind of at the heart of Traverse Journeys. So without further ado, welcome to Iceland. I'm going to pass it over to Ryan to get us started. So he's going to tell us a little bit about this really amazing country.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ashley. So yeah, like I said before, my name is Ryan, and I'm a permanent resident of Iceland and one of the owners of the local operator, Hidden Iceland. Like I said, we've been talking with Ashley since 2018. The pandemic got in the way, but we've been running tours together for quite some time now in various places around the country. I personally moved to Iceland many years ago in order to pursue my dream of becoming a glacier guide. So when I came to Iceland, just like the name suggests, and just like the job that I was hoping for suggests, it was this icy, barren landscape. And yet when I actually arrived, I realized that it was not really like that at all. Sure, 14% of the country is covered in ice, but this landscape and this terrain, despite being right at the edge of the Arctic Circle, it's actually quite lush and beautiful and filled with life, lots of different animals and lots of flora and lots of vegetation. And just as much as the glaciers are a draw to bring you to Iceland, we also have the exact opposite side of the spectrum, which is the volcanoes. As you may or may have not read in the news recently, there is not one, not two, but 3 different volcanic eruptions that have happened in the last 3 years in the country. So when we say that Iceland is not just for one specific reason to come, I think you'll agree that whether it's glaciers, volcanoes, or the rich, beautiful landscape, there is a reason to come. Now, one of the things before we move on to the history and culture that I would like to mention is that, you know, we travel around the world, we see lots of amazing things, and despite, you know, the world being, you know, not fully explored, I would say that there's like lots of local population and huge amounts of tourists. The great thing about Iceland, even on the busiest times of the year, you only have about 350,000 people who live in the country over the space of an area that's about 5 times the size of Hawaii. So you've got, you know, only 300,000 people there, and then over the space of a year, maybe 1.5 to 2 million visitors. So even on the busiest days, you can feel like you're entering a landscape that in certain moments can be completely empty, and as I like to call it, imperfectly known, which is actually a quote from Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth, which is based in Iceland. So Iceland itself, like the people of Iceland, you know, it depends who you speak to, but some of them will say, yes, I am a Viking. I am a Viking descendant from the original settlers as far back as 874 AD, when the exiled Vikings from Norway came over and decided that Iceland, despite it being a little bit cold sometimes, was a great place to settle. And then over the space of about 50 or 60 years, this landscape that was completely empty started to fill up with people, maybe 30 or 40,000, would make their way across to the country and settle in lots of different places. And as they did that, they realized that this harsh landscape was something that couldn't really be lived in autonomously. They needed to create a system, a parliament, a way of life that would allow them to trade with each other and to be cohesive and become a community. So by 930 AD, they created what is now a world record for the longest surviving parliamentary system in the world, which is quite impressive, I think, considering all the volcanic eruptions, superstorms, and flash floods from glaciers that we get every century or so. I won't go into too much detail about the history, or we would be here for quite a long time, but suffice to say, Iceland, being so sparse and on its own, was ruled over by a few Scandinavian countries, originally Norway, taken over by Sweden, and then eventually Denmark. But it was in 1918, after quite a few years of turbulent relationship between the Danish kingdom and Iceland, that they became partially independent, and then received full republic autonomy by 1944. And since then, they've went from strength to strength. And Iceland has gone from being a very sparse, poverty-driven country to quite a wealthy country. In fact, I would say based on how people are treated and the wages and the social aspects of life in Iceland, it's one of the best countries in the world to live. And one of the reasons I still live there today. So that's kind of Iceland in a nutshell. The final thing I would say there is when you do speak to local Icelanders and you say something like "Hvar kaffihús," which translates to "where is the coffee shop?" That's the most important sentence you'll need. That's roughly how they would say it all the way back when the Vikings first settled, because the language is what's referred to as Old Norse, or a translation of Old Norse throughout the centuries. But because there's such a small population and there was so few immigration levels over the years, the language has remained very close to the way it used to be. So when you are talking to a local Icelander and you ask them, "Hvar kaffihús," where is the coffee shop? This is roughly how it would sound 1,000 years ago when you're talking to a real life Viking. Although I don't think they had coffee shops back then, but you never know. Okay, so that was a very brief version of why Iceland is amazing. Of course, I know a lot of you will be here today in order to learn about some of the amazing locations that we travel to on tour. Now, Ashley and the Traverse team, they plan trips of all different kinds in Iceland. So it could be anything from a group trip with up to 12 people, or it could be a self-drive tour, or something more of a holistic retreat style journey where you maybe focused in one area. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to highlight some of the locations that we travel to, not necessarily on every trip, but some of the most well-known ones. You can see from that little map on the screen there that we actually only cover in this presentation all the way to the southeast and then up to the west. The rest of the island is accessible and amazing as well. But it's not necessarily something that many people try to achieve on their first trip to Iceland. For example, going around the island, if you want to do it properly and slowly and to do things as you go instead of just taking pictures as you're driving, then you're probably talking about 12 or 13 days. Whereas I like to plan things with Ashley where even if it's only 8 or 9 or even 10 days, you're not going too fast. You're actually immersing yourself and enjoying the experience instead of just ticking the boxes, which I think most of you would agree is a good way to see the country. The next slides. So we cover a lot of places. The locations on this slide basically just cover some of the places: the Reykjanes Peninsula in the southwest, Reykjavik, the capital city, along the south coast and into the southeast, which is the Vatnajökull National Park, all the way to the far west in the Snaefellsnes Peninsula. And then for the more adventurous people doing glacier hikes, and then, even though it's a very popular area, the Golden Circle with its humongous waterfalls and geothermal activity is still a must-see as well. So yeah, the chances are you're going to land at Keflavik International Airport and make your way quickly into the capital city of Reykjavik. The capital has about 200,000 people out of the 360,000 or so who live in the entire country. So you might think that sounds like it's very busy, but even during the height of tourism season, the roads can be virtually empty on certain times of the day. It still very much feels like a fishing village trying to be a city, if that makes sense. You've got this beautiful harbor that surrounds the entire city. They've got this one church called Hallgrímskirkju, which took 50 years to build, and it's sticking up right in the middle of the city, still the very highest point by far. So no matter how industrial or financially driven this city gets, the monuments are the things that really are what you can see from all around. And then, the people in Iceland, they're not there just for the tourists. They have their own industries and their own livelihoods. And there's a great art scene, an incredible music scene. Every bar you go to, the chances are there's going to be live music at some point that day. And then, of course, if you have extra time, some of the museums are just incredible. My personal favorite is the Settlement Museum. So this is a museum where they were building a hotel, and as they were digging down into the ground, they found an old Viking settlement. And instead of just knocking it down and deciding to continue with this hotel, they built a museum around it instead. So you can learn about the Viking heritage and history, as well as actually seeing, where people lived back in probably around 900 or 1000 AD. So it's an incredible city to see. At least one day, I would say, is probably the minimum you'd want to spend there. So then the second you leave Reykjavik, and by the way, Reykja means smoke or smoky. So when we say Reykjavik, that translates to the smoky bay. That's the capital city, Reykjavik. When we say Reykjanes, that translates to the smoky peninsula. So when we go into this peninsula, which is very close to the capital city, the first thing that you're going to notice a lot is the volcanic activity in the area, which in turn creates a lot of geothermal power or geothermal smoke and activity. So along the way on this particular day, you may go to one of the most regularly erupting geysers called Gunnaber. Erupts constantly all day, all year round, spraying water in your face if you go in the wrong direction. There's also the Reykjanes lighthouse, where you get crashing waves flowing over the top of extinct lava fields that have cooled down and solidified. And then if you want to actually see what a lava tunnel was like after it stopped erupting from a volcanic eruption, we can go into Raufarhöll's Hitler lava tunnel. This is an eruption from about 5,200 years ago that has remained a solid cave ever since. There's all these beautiful, wonderful colors on the walls. I won't spoil the surprise, but there's something to do under there that tends to scare people a little, but I'll leave that to your imagination. Let's just say it's dark. But the one thing that you would notice in this area today compared to 3 or 4 years ago before the pandemic is the volcano that is currently erupting is in that area as well. I'm sure there'll be questions at the end, or you're wondering yourself, that volcano that's erupting called Gildingadalur or Fagradalsfjall, depending on who you talk to. The question is, can you see it from the roads? Can you walk to it? Can you fly to it? How do you see it safely? And the answer is, depending on when you travel, will depend on whether the lava is still flowing. It will also depend on whether there's still gases coming out, which are quite poisonous, and you wouldn't want to go there. And it also depends on whether it's still, of course, erupting and releasing lava flow. So, in the past, we have been to this volcano with customers, but at the moment, we're suggesting that the best and safest way to see any fresh lava is to actually get a helicopter over the top. And then you can see down into the crater, all the smoke coming up. It's quite wonderful. To walk there might be a bit arduous, but you never know with these things. Lava flows in every direction at the moment. If it is still erupting by, say, next year, it could be added to one of the itineraries. So we'll see. So then as we leave the Reykjanes Peninsula, this kind of smoky peninsula with lots of volcanic activity, we become a little bit more tranquil and travel along the south coast towards the east. As we go along the coast, you have incredible views of extinct or dormant volcanoes like the Vatnajökull volcano that erupted back in 2010. And you'll see ice caps and glaciers sitting on top of these volcanoes that are perched on the peaks. You'll manage to sneak around the back of beautiful 100 200 feet, I always try to convert to feet and meters, a 200-foot waterfall called Seljalandsfoss that you can slide behind. You can actually walk behind and try not to slip on the mud. Or the Skogafoss waterfall, which is in that picture on the right there. It's about the same height, about 200 feet. The really interesting thing about that, aside from it being incredibly fast flowing water, all from glacial meltwater, is that it's in quite a few different episodes of the TV show Game of Thrones, if you've seen that, or Vikings, and even in the most recent Eurovision movie. So it's quite a popular destination. And you can absolutely get wet if you get too close to that one. Spray just goes everywhere. And then that picture on the bottom left there is called Reynisfjara. And believe it or not, despite the volcanic eruptions, despite the glaciers and the meltwater and the floods and the storms on the bad days, the Reynisfjara Black Sand Beach is actually one of the more dangerous places to go if you're not careful, which thankfully we would be. And it's because this area has like this black sand that's been created from past volcanic eruptions. And then you have crashing waves that just flow up over the sand and towards the little caves that are created almost like a puzzle piece of basalt columns from, again, past eruptions. So people want to see all that stuff, but then they don't think about the waves too much. So that on that day, there's always this battle of, oh, how close can we go before it gets a bit too close to the waves? It's actually a really exhilarating experience. And then as we head further along the south coast, fantastic picture there. This is what you have to wear, by the way, if you want to go anywhere near these waterfalls. If you want to get any closer, then you'll literally just be drenched, soaking wet entirely. I talk about floods and all these scary things. The weather in Iceland is actually, especially in May, June, July, August, and September, is what's referred to as a temperate climate. And that means that even though Iceland is very close to the Arctic Circle, it's between 64 and 66 degrees latitude. So 66 is the edge of the Arctic Circle. Even though it's in this area that should be like, this barren wasteland, desolate and frozen in wintertime, it really isn't like that at all. In the wintertime, the average temperature is about 32 degrees Fahrenheit, so just around the freezing point. So there might be days in winter where you get perfectly blue skies and this beautiful kind of low sunrise and low sunset that just creates this like full day of the golden hour. Of course, there's northern lights at night as well, which we'll touch on a little bit later. And then in the summertime, because of this temperate climate, you do get a bit of rain and a little bit of wind, but generally speaking, it's never too hot and it's never too cold, which is great for growing things like berries and fruits outside. It's great for adventuring on tours, and it's great for animals and birds to flock into the country. So, despite the odds slightly bad, windy and wet day, it tends to be a really fantastic place to go as long as you're wearing the right clothing. Now, when I first moved to Iceland, I said before, I came to become a glacier guide, and being a glacier guide requires you to go on a glacier. So my very first step was to travel all the way out to the southeast to the Vatnajökull National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And this is where all the big glaciers are. It's where if you join us on one of the glacier hikes, you'll go up into these what are called alpine glaciers, where there's crevasses and ice and cracks and holes. And as long as you're with a safe and local guide, then you can see some of these things up close and personal. You can touch the ice, be in these kind of wilderness settings, and yet even though you've never put on a pair of crampons before, you can feel safe and feel like you've experienced Iceland in its true form. It's not for everybody. It's still a little bit difficult to walk on uneven terrain, but generally speaking, it's a pretty impressive place to go. And then, of course, the repercussions of glaciers melting is that they melt into big lakes or lagoons, and those lagoons create icebergs. So at the Glacier Lagoon in the southeast, you've got building-sized icebergs floating around pretty close to your face, actually. So yeah, I'm a bit biased, but the southeast of Iceland is one of my favorite places in the country. Not just for the glaciers, but it's a lot more remote as well. A lot less people travel there, depending on what your activities are. Then if you're trying to map it out in your head, we went from the capital city to the southwest in the Reykjanes. We've traveled along the south coast, all the way to the southeast, where the Vatnajökull National Park is. We've traveled back along the south coast and into an area that's very popular with tourists because it's very close to Reykjavik, called the Golden Circle. Now, with a company like Hidden Iceland and the type of tours that Ashley plans called Traverse Journeys, you might think, well, this place seems a bit too busy for the kind of experiences that we're looking for, and that's an understandable consideration. However, when we've tried many times to skip past this place in an effort to see the more hidden spots, but there is a reason why people go here, and it's not just for logistic reasons. You've got hot pools that are the oldest in the country that you can bathe in. You've got mighty waterfalls that spew out more water than on surge days. You can have enough water like the Amazon River pouring over some of these waterfalls. You've got greenhouses that use the geothermal heat to create tomatoes and then grow them all year round. And then, of course, the ever erupting Strokr geyser that fires about 20, 30 meters into the air every 5 or 6 minutes. It's an incredible sight. And then, if we are talking about, immersing ourselves in nature, getting away from the normal tourist routes, the Westman Islands is probably one of the better places to go over to. So it's a short 35-minute ferry ride, but it's punctuated with two very specific things that make it well worth the trip. And that's one, there's about 1.4 million puffins that fly here every summer, usually around the start of May, and they vacate around the end of August. And then in 1973, there was a volcanic eruption. You can actually see it in the picture on the far left of the island. There's this kind of weird cone shape. That's the volcano called Eldfjall. It erupted in 1973, lasted for about 5 months. And as the lava, flowed out in every direction, it added 20% of extra land to the island, while destroying a good few hundred houses as well. But either way, it added extra land to the island. It would have been much worse, in fact, if it wasn't for the locals who took water from the ocean and sprayed it onto the lava as it was approaching the houses and redirected the lava out towards the ocean. Quite an incredible experience to try and save your town from encroaching lava. But, if anyone's going to do it, it's going to be local Icelanders for sure. So well worth the trip across there, I would say. And then, we've done the southwest, we've done the south, we've done the islands in the south, we went a little bit into the side of the island to the southeast. And this here, Snaefellsnes, the peninsula is north of Reykjavik. It's in the far west. It's about as far west as you would go on any normal trip as a first timer. The one thing I would say about Snaefellsnes is often referred to as Little Iceland or a mini Iceland, because the glaciers in the southeast and the volcanoes in the southwest and the huge waterfalls and the crashing waves, all of these things across the country, you can find also in Snaefellsnes. So if you can manage to get up there for one day and travel around and you've got some great weather, you can really experience all of Iceland in the space of one day with its massive volcanoes. And again, if you've seen the TV show Game of Thrones, there's an arrow-shaped mountain in the north of the peninsula called Kirkjufell, which was filmed many times for different scenes. I think Jon Snow was standing in front of this pointy mountain at one point. Very iconic scenes. My favorite part of the peninsula, though, is this picture in the foreground here. That's an area called Arnastapi. And these are a collection of basalt columns that are being kind of crushed together as lava's being pouring out towards the coast. And then as waves are coming in and crashing against them, they're creating these cavities and these holes. And when they're done in such a way that it's falling apart, but not completely, you can actually walk over the top of them. So that little person in the picture there is very brave to be walking over at quite a deep drop, but certainly worth it for the pictures that you get to take and the experience of walking across. I absolutely love Snaefellsnes. So, this is just a quick presentation trying to cover some of the places that you might go. There's an unlimited amount of places, to be honest. Even in the locations that we've already talked about, I could talk about each one for 2 hours easily. But we talk about crashing waves and volcanoes and glaciers, but you got to remember that Iceland is also this functioning, working country with locals who just want to, live off the land. So one of the things that will be punctuated across the country is seeing how the locals live, or perhaps a better word in the past was survive. Landscapes that grow berries and fruits and root vegetables naturally, great. Areas where cows and other animals can graze. Sheep are released into the wild at the start of the summer and left out there on their own for the entire time. These are all things you would expect from people living on this kind of isolated island. But the other thing that I think is quite notable is the geothermal heat, which is basically a volcano, or the heat from a volcano will heat up water under the ground. That water will boil, and as the water pours out into different directions, the locals can use that for various things. So they can use it, as you can imagine, by bathing in. So the Blue Lagoon, you've probably all heard of, the Secret Lagoon, and 20 other different hot pools that you can absolutely go and check out while you're in Iceland. But they also use it for, boiling foods and baking breads. So they put rye bread under the ground. They also have these greenhouses that use the heat from the geothermal effects to grow fruit and vegetables all year round as well. So I'm not going to say that Iceland is fully autonomous, but it's definitely getting to a stage where they're growing more and more and more of their own local produce. That living in Iceland is getting, more isolated in all the right ways, if you know what I mean. Yeah, and then one of the bigger highlights of my time in Iceland is the first time I rode an Icelandic horse, because these Icelandic horses that are only they're extinct anywhere else in the world. These horses are much smaller and much lighter than most other horses. But the interesting thing is that when they run, they have this fifth gait called the tolt, T-O-L-T, with two dots over the O. And when they run, instead of galloping up and down and you're bouncing left and right and you're falling over, they actually always keep one hoof on the ground. So they're kind of running almost like a canter, is that the word? I don't know. But either way, it's much smoother. So it's more just like a vibration as you're running rather than bouncing up and down. It's really cool. So I think on a lot of these itineraries, we have that as an optional add-on, which is absolutely worth it in my mind. So I'll take a little break. I think I'm going to pass you on to Ashley for a second. She wants to talk a little bit more about the traverse versions of the itineraries. Is that right, Ashley?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ryan. Ryan is just a wealth of knowledge on Iceland. We've had many, many, many hours of chats about the country. So just a little bit about the Traverse experience. For those of you that are new to Traverse journeys, I talked a little bit in the beginning about our ethos around people, planet, purpose, and really meaningful and transformative travel. And we're very selective with the partners on the ground that we choose. And just some of the things that you'll find in our itineraries in general, but also specific to this Iceland. Like we really love boutique, like B&Bs or like guest houses, like 3-4 star is our general kind of level for accommodations, but we really look for locally owned, where maybe the owners come out and greet you and meet you. That's really a key ingredient of our experiences. And in this itinerary, definitely a lot of historic and cultural highlights. There's a lot of fascinating history in Iceland. This is an active itinerary. You get time in nature. It's immersive. The elements in Iceland are something that really bring you into the present. I think that's one of the things that I love about Iceland and the weather is that you're there and you're in the moment, and rain or shine, you're getting to experience it. Here at Traverse, we love seasonal cuisine. We do a lot with like regenerative and sustainable agriculture. Iceland is a great example, like Ryan was explaining, on becoming more internal, of having a lot of their own seasonally grown produce. There's a tomato farm that we visit that's really fascinating because it's all, as he was explaining, using thermal heat so that tomatoes can be provided year-round locally rather than being imported. We love to visit UNESCO sites, and in this case, we also do. We'll talk a little bit here about sustainability and how we implement a lot of those practices into the travel, like every aspect of travel. And then the types of travel that we do are a small group, like-minded travelers. For Iceland specifically, we have a group tour. We also have an adventure retreat, which Allison, our retreat leader, is on the call with us today. So I might give her the spotlight in a minute to just say a quick little hi. And then we also offer self-guided itineraries, self-drive itineraries. So we handle all the logistics. We've got a great route. You just have to rent the car and follow the plan. So it makes it very easy for you. So here's just a few pictures of accommodations, like that sunrise. I was there for it. It was just phenomenal. You know, you're out in these like really remote places, which is just such an incredible experience in Iceland. The sky is just so big. Food, it's true. Puffins want coffee. There's lots of great food experiences in Iceland. You can see on the left here the tomato farm that I was talking about. And they tell us a little bit about their practices. Those little boxes, those are beehives. You can see on the bottom, the lady making rye bread using the thermal heat. A few more pictures. There's a lot of traditional food on Iceland, of course, or especially around, seafood, but there's also a lot of really interesting fusion in Iceland because there's immigration patterns that have come in, a lot of influences from different places. So we love to explore those kind of crossovers and influences in food. And then we'll talk a little bit about sustainability. So we really prioritize partners who prioritize sustainability, even like from all angles, whether we're talking about carbon footprint reduction, leave no trace practices when you're out hiking, of course, plastic waste reduction, that's a big piece of it. And then also for our Iceland itinerary, we visit a very fascinating initiative around the sustainable fishing industry called Ocean Cluster. Ryan, do you want to talk a little bit about the sustainability piece?
Yeah. And when we started working together, Ashley, was the first thing I actually said was, we're very impressed with your local operation and how leave no trace mentality is kind of instilled. And when Ashley said that's something that was very important to her and our travelers, we realized it was a perfect match, really. So our local company, we have a very strong environmental policy, which I won't go into too much detail, but one of the things that we kind of accentuate is that we are what's referred to as carbon neutral. That can come under a few different versions of how you do that. Of course, we're trying to reduce our impact in all the ways in which we can. However, we know that traveling to Iceland and traveling within Iceland is going to have an impact. As you can imagine, I started in Iceland as a glacier guide, and I've watched the glaciers literally melt away under my feet due to the increase in temperature. So it's always been something very important to me. What we prioritize at the moment in order to reduce or improve the environment is twofold. The first one is what's quite an obvious one, where we invest in areas of land where we plant trees. And as you travel around Iceland, you'll see you'll hear this joke constantly that says, oh, if you get lost in an Icelandic forest, all you have to do is stand up. And it's not because the forests are so small, it's because most of them have only been planted in the last 10 or 15 years. So half these mighty forests are only the size of your shoulder. So it takes time for sure to plant trees. And as we know, trees suck in carbon dioxide, but they also help with these things called ash clouds that we experience in Iceland. So they help with soil erosion, they stop the air quality from going bad during storms. But the one that I'm really proud of that we do in the local area is a thing called the Wetland Fund. The Wetland Fund is basically an initiative where they take areas of land in Iceland that have been artificially drained of swamp water in order for farming to take place, that have now fallen into disrepair. And all they have to do in order to stop this desolate, empty landscape from just doing nothing is to fill in those holes that they've dug in to get the water out. And then within a few short months, the water will rise again. It will fill up, the vegetation will return, animals and birds will fly in, and these new nature reserves kind of pop up overnight. But the reason why they're so impressive, aside from it being good locally, is that they also act as a carbon sink. So they stop carbon dioxide that would naturally be emitted from the land into the atmosphere. They stop that from happening almost immediately. So those are two of the things that we do in terms of carbon neutrality. But also it's really important to us that as we travel around the country, the local guides that you'll interact with will teach you about all the changing landscapes of Iceland. They'll teach you about the sustainable practices that are taking part in Iceland. As Ashley said, we choose local. We choose the local farm owners' lands to stay in, and the same with the local foods. And then we do our best to actually educate as well. So it's two of the things that we visit while we're going around, depending on the itinerary, is a place called Heitlisheidi, which is a geothermal power station. This geothermal power station, I'm not going to tell you all about it now, but this power station basically uses the heat from the volcano to generate energy via water turning to steam to spinning turbines generating electricity. And that's completely renewable, way better than any of the dirty coal and that sort of stuff. But beyond that, and this is really interesting actually, is that they've started this initiative called Carb Fix, where they can physically suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and push it down into the ground, mix it with water in a type of basaltic rock that turns this carbon dioxide into rocks again, or into carbon. So you get a chance to visit that when you're traveling. So it's not just about reducing, it's about removing, which is fantastic. And then the final one, regardless of how much we're talking about climate change and carbon dioxide and improving the natural environment, we're also trying to reduce our impact as well. So, I don't know how many people here are vegetarians or pescatarians or whatever, but what we can say for sure is that one of Iceland's biggest industries is the fishing industry. And there's a local initiative started by a man named Thor, who believed that when the fish are caught, that you catch a codfish and then you eat some of the cod and then the rest gets thrown away. Sounds like a normal thing to do, but this man's belief, alongside all the other people who have invested since then, believe that you should be able to be much more sustainable and use every different part of the fish. So there's this kind of investment program where all these little local companies are using, like the collagen, for example, from the fish, and using that in soft drinks and medicines. And the skin from the cods is used for wrapping bandages to help with burns, and basically trying to create an initiative where they say 100% fish, where every part of the fish is used for something. So yeah, it's about sustainability, it's about environmental reduction impact, it's about creating nature reserves, it's about basically everything, and hopefully giving you guys some inspiration when you go back to your own lives to say, okay, maybe this is how the rest of the world can live, if we just take some time to be almost cohabitate the world instead of using the resources. So maybe that was an over explanation there, I apologize, but that's I get quite passionate about environmental initiatives. So yeah, that's some pictures from the ocean cluster there.
Yeah, all these pictures are from the ocean cluster, which Ryan was just talking about, like the fish skin leather, different kinds of like food and medicine products. You can see the dial on the right of like all the different ways all of the resources of the fish can be used. And it's super fascinating because it's such a critical industry of Iceland and so historic. So something we like to explore. All right, so we'll move on to a few tips and then we'll catch you guys for some questions. I know there's some in the chat that are coming. So we can talk a little bit about when to see the Northern Lights. Ryan, do you want to take this one and go for it?
Yeah, so this note here says that the Northern Lights are best seen between October and March. I mean, that's true for sure. What you need for Northern Lights is darkness. I mean, you also need the sun to be sending electrically charged particles through the atmosphere at the exact right angle and motion and speeds in order to hit the particles in the atmosphere that glow, ionize, and create the Northern Lights. Sorry, I did that fast on purpose. But basically, in order to see the Northern Lights in Iceland, you need darkness. And during June, July, and August, there's 24 hours of at least some form of light. So I would say if you are trying to see the Northern Lights, I would come no earlier than the 1st of September and no later than probably the 10th of April. The reason I wouldn't go too close to those outside lines is simply because there's just not that much nighttime. So you might have to stay up until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning waiting for it to get dark. I am not a big believer in joining some big bus company and then driving around for 2 hours and looking up into the sky. the chances of you seeing the Northern Lights in that 1-2 hour window while you're in a big bus is very minimal. Whereas if you stay overnight outside of the city, like in a little guest house like this called Lilia, then you can just walk out of your front door whenever you want and look up. So I would say that's the best way to go about it. Try not to make Northern Lights your sole reason for coming to Iceland, but certainly create itineraries that allow you to hopefully see them each night while you're having a great time during the day. Anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on it.
Yeah. And there are a lot of the locals are all in the know. There's Facebook groups, a lot of these little accommodations, like they'll do a wake up call. So if you're like, call me if the Northern Lights are happening, they will. So that's pretty cool. You can go to bed and then at 2 o'clock, get up and see them. So it's pretty exciting. And then that falls into this kind of when to travel. So you can see some of the key things that you'll get for each season during the spring. Like Ryan was saying, that midnight sun, puffin season, like in the Westman Islands, lambing, who doesn't love little baby lambs? In the winter, the like very dark season, mostly dark the whole time, as Ryan was saying, like the best chance because of the darkness to see the Northern Lights. People don't often think about traveling to Iceland in the winter, but it's still absolutely doable. Maybe the little more intrepid travelers, but absolutely can be done. And then in the fall, like we go in the fall, we go in October, it's slightly cooler, much more higher chance of seeing the Northern Lights, horseback riding, which of course, again, you can do year round, but it's a great time for that. Really beautiful landscapes. And the summer has the really long days. I think personally, it's really great for self-drive. We tend to offer our group tours on shoulder seasons. So for us, that would be spring and fall. And that's for a variety of reasons, also because of like just the impact of tourism in high season. But if you're, if you can only travel during the summer, that can be a great opportunity to do a self-drive itinerary. So I don't know, Ryan, if you want to add anything to all of that.
Yeah, I agree. Self-drive specifically, the reason Ashley and I, we don't really tend to recommend self-drive outside of the summer season is just because, the weather can be amazing, but there's some days where it's windy or rainy or even snowy. Even in October, we get some snow on the ground. And as soon as you start to have to deal with that yourself and you don't know how the local weather is managed, then it just makes it so much more stressful for you to try and figure things out. So you might as well go with a local driver guide who's been there for their entire lives, who've driven through storms. And then all you have to do is worry about enjoying yourself, really, and let us do all the hard stuff. Winter time is a fantastic time to come as a guided tour. And yeah, I think one of the questions I get the most, and I have to follow up with a question every time, is someone says, "Oh, when should I come to Iceland?" And I'm like, well, like Ashley just said, there's a good reason to come to Iceland at any time of the year. So my question back to you is, what is the reason you want to come to Iceland? And then we can start talking about when is best. So, like Ashley said, puffins are only a summer season. North Lights are only when it's dark. Midnight sun is only summer as well. And then the shoulder seasons tend to be a little bit cheaper in terms of hotels and things, and just a little bit quieter as well. So there's always a good reason to come at any time of the year, really.
Exactly. Yeah. And another question we get asked a lot, of course, is what to wear. And I've heard a great quote that maybe some of you, and I'm sure Ryan, you've heard, that there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. So it's definitely a good place to have all your layers, lots of rain gear, waterproof pants and boots. Ryan, when we partner together, a lot of times we can provide a lot of those things. So there's like certain heavy duty weather gear that you can have during your trip there. Hats and gloves, of course. We have some really good packing lists for like hiking itineraries. One of the things we recommend is bringing some biodegradable laundry soap, because a lot of these places in the country don't offer laundry services. So you can do a little sink wash. So those are key items for what to wear. And then just some quick tips on money in Iceland. We also have a blog that I'll include when I send a follow-up email, but why is Iceland so expensive? So people ask that question a lot. There's some very solid answers for that, but some key things to know. The country's on the Icelandic krona. You can look that up at xe.com for rates. It does fluctuate with the US dollar quite a bit. So just because a price is something now doesn't mean it's going to be exactly the same in 4 months or a week. Cash is not really needed. Credit card is good. You know, as you're mentally preparing your budget for Iceland, it can come with some sticker shock, like in terms of meals, for example, or like drinks out. You know, a lot of this, again, going back to that blog, which I encourage you to read, but Iceland is really strong on fair wages and employment law. And there's also the VAT, value added tax. And it is an island. Tipping is not like so high as it is in the United States, you know, maybe a little bit, but some savings tips, like going with groups, you know, if you're looking to save money on it, like having a few key really good meals, and then otherwise maybe stock up on snacks at the store, you know, eat like a local. Reykjavik is great for walking. You can do shared transit. So lots of good money saving tips. I know we're kind of going a little over time, so I want to keep us, you know, wrap up a little bit, but some opportunities to join us, and then we'll get to questions. So what we've got coming up in 2024, we've got our self-guided, can be done year round. As Ryan said, summer is a really great time for it, for just driving ease. We have in May 2024 our adventure retreat with Allison, who is on, and I'll let you, Allison, say a little hi in just a minute. And then we've got our 2024 October group trip. So just for joining today, we have a little discount for you. I'll send this in a follow-up email. And then we've got more events coming up if you want to learn about some other places: Chile, Dominica, Morocco, Portugal. So you can sign up the same way you did for this one. And now, without further ado, a quick hi from Allison. I'll put you on unmute there, if I can. There we go.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. Yeah, as you heard, I will be the retreat host for the May trip, for the adventure trip. So just a little bit about myself. I'm a licensed psychotherapist. I am trained in adventure therapy and somatic experiencing, among other modalities. And I'm also a lover of adventure travel in general. I'm a hiker, skier, all the outdoors activities, and adventure therapy is a great way to use the natural gifts of nature, especially at a place like Iceland, to learn more about ourselves and each other. So I hope some of you will join us in May.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Allison. Okay, so some questions. I'm just looking through the questions. So Cindy, you asked about a minimum, maximum amount of days for a custom itinerary. You know, there's not necessarily, but as Ryan and I were saying like earlier, you know, it's a really good place for slow travel. So if you only have a couple of days, you'll probably be limited to like Reykjavik and the Golden Circle. If you can afford more time, you know, really 8 days is kind of, I'd say, the minimum for kind of what we covered in the kind of southeast and like western part. So that would be my recommendation. I don't know, Ryan, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, 8 days is probably the minimum for what we covered. And then if you want to spend more time in Reykjavik, which I often encourage, then even 9 and 10 days is something that's a good number as well. That's about the norm, actually, in terms of our requests for private customized tours. They tend to be 8, 9, 10 days, and we can fit in quite a lot during that time.
Yeah. Any more questions? Happy to answer them. I'm so surprised. Usually there are many. That means we covered lots. I'm glad that worked out. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. I know we went kind of longer than we had planned, but I hope that you found it helpful, and we will be following up with some information shortly. And thanks again for joining. Hope to see you again.
All right. Thank you very much, guys. It was a pleasure chatting to everyone.